You know, just so you know, the mind's eye goes out and looks at things. It's, no matter where you are, it's not cultural. It has to do with humans. So if you're alien, you can ignore this part, okay? If you're human, though, your mind's eye is going to go. Now that means that I select the f-stop that I want. The camera's going to pick the correct shutter speed. And that's that exposure thing, right? We have X amount of light falling on a scene. We'll take the shutter speed and aperture, and that combination of two of them gives us the correct exposure for the light falling on that scene. Everybody with me on that so far? That makes sense? Okay? Okay, ISO. That's a real common question.
Aperture.
I'm always in the basement. Okay? I'm not a raise the ISO kind of guy. I shot film for 20 years. It wasn't like an option. So you learn how to be a craftsman. So we shot the ASA, as they said back then, or now the ISO. I'm always in the basement. And why is that? My images often are getting large. You know, last year I had an image that wrapped a bus in San Francisco. It has to have the ultimate quality. As long as I have the quality, I have a market for my stuff. And cameras, like the D4, are raising that bar more and more. You can go higher and higher. And, you know, yes, technically you cannot see the difference. I mean, the D4, it has an auto ISO for the video, which is unbelievable. And I use that for the video all the time. I don't use it for the stills. I'm still in control. All right, so you got the light coming in, okay, shutter speed f-stop, there you go. And people look for what is considered, you know, the perfect exposure or the best exposure, and they do that by a lot of different means. Okay, you can look at the back of the camera, you can set the setting so you have the blinkies. Okay, what I affectionately call, you know, the highlight warnings. And those blinkies do a good thing for you. They visually show you where in the frame, okay, you might be having areas not technically blown out or lost or gone to paper white, but more importantly, realize that that's where the mind's eye is going to go to first. So it's a visual way of saying, oh, that's there. I might not want the mind's eye going there because it takes you away from the subject. So then you have a tool you can actually visually see where that might be. Okay. Same time, you might use a histogram. Okay, it's a valid tool. I don't use histograms because there isn't a histogram that goes out. You don't see histograms in these pictures, right? You look at the picture and you go, either I like it or I don't like it. The public doesn't go, let me see the histogram first. Right? They don't do that. So then it comes to this thing called exposure. Okay, getting back to the f-stop, the shutter speed. When it comes to exposure, I would love to encourage people to think of exposure equaling emotion. Use exposure to communicate the emotion or the mood of that moment. Forget the highlights, forget the shadows. They really, you know, the general public, they don't care. They're going to look at that photograph, do one or two things. They're going to go like this, and they stare at it. They go like this, and they don't stare at it. They like it or they don't like it. It's that simple. But all the stuff that went into that picture, taken for granted. They just like it or dislike it. Okay, it's that simple. So with that in mind, the tool that I use a lot in the body is called the exposure compensation button. Okay, exposure compensation is a huge tool. Now,
Exposure
how does it all tie in?
compensation.
Well, you've got your basic daylight exposure. Okay, you take your ISO, make it into a shutter speed, and put it at f16. Okay, so with 100 ISO, it'd be 1/25th at f16. You go out on a basic sunny day, it's going to give you a basic exposure. Been around since the beginning. Coon's age, actually longer. Okay? Huh? Maybe 3 Coon's age. Okay? So, with that in mind, all right, exposure compensation, what it's going to let us do is actually influence that meter, that advice the camera's giving us, to bring out in the exposure the emotion we're seeing. Now, in this process, one thing about camera technology is time been lost, and that's called the stepless shutter speed. Anybody heard that term? I mean, back in the 80s, this was like big. Okay, right now, no one even knows what's going on. What stepless shutter speeds mean is I pick f-stop. Okay, the camera has a stepless shutter speed from 30 seconds to 1/8,000th, if that's the top end. They can pick any number in there. Okay, so how many is that? Well, there's 8,000 shutter speeds between 1 second and 1/8,000th. There's 8,000 different ones it could pick from. So when you're out there shooting, even though the camera might be saying 1/25th up here in the LCD, it could be 102. It could be 147. It could be any one of these numbers to give you the most accurate exposure for what you've told the camera. That's much more accurate than you can be using manual, and it's so much faster. And the thing is, you can sit there and fine-tune exposure for the way you want to communicate. Now, in this whole process,